At Thanksgiving dinner, they made me eat in the garage while my own family celebrated in my dining room. She's just the nanny, my sister-in-law announced to our guests. Natalie belongs with the help. But what they didn't know was that I owned every brick, every beam, and every inch of the house they thought was theirs. And by the end of the night, they would learn exactly who they had been living off of all these years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Natalie Cross, and this is the story of how I discovered that the family I had sacrificed everything for had been systematically planning to steal the life I built from nothing. It was Thanksgiving 2023, and I sat alone in the cold garage of my childhood home in Millbrook Falls, Oregon, a house I had purchased and renovated with my own money after our parents died. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a successful pediatric surgeon who had worked 16-hour days for 12 years to build a life of stability and comfort, reduced to eating leftover turkey off a paper plate while sitting on a paint bucket between my car and old lawn equipment. Through the thin walls, I could hear the laughter and conversation from the main house, my house, where my older brother Derek and his wife Camille were hosting what they called their annual family gathering. 23 guests filled the dining room I had custom designed, drinking wine from the collection I had carefully curated, eating from the china set I had inherited from our grandmother and painstakingly restored. Natalie's always been more comfortable in simple settings, I heard Camille explaining to someone, her voice carrying that practiced tone of charitable condescension she had perfected over the years. She's wonderful with children, of course, but she's never really understood how to present herself in social situations. We thought she'd be more at ease out here. The "we" stung the most. Derek, who had moved into the house 3 years ago during his temporary financial difficulties, had long since stopped pretending this was a short-term arrangement. What had begun as my brother needing a place to stay after his business failed had evolved into something far more permanent and far more sinister. I pulled my medical school sweatshirt tighter around myself and checked my phone. 3 missed calls from the hospital, but nothing urgent enough to provide an escape from this humiliation. As the head of pediatric cardiac surgery at Millbrook General, I was used to being treated with respect, consulted on life and death decisions, trusted with the most delicate procedures. But here, in my own home, I had somehow become the family embarrassment who needed to be hidden away when important people came over. The garage door creaked as it opened slightly, and my nephew Tyler peeked through. At 15, he had always been different from the rest of Derek's family, quieter, more observant, less willing to go along with his parents' version of events. "Aunt Nat," he whispered, glancing back toward the house, "this is really messed up. You know that, right?" I managed a weak smile. "It's fine, Tyler. Your parents are just trying to manage a lot of guests." He stepped fully into the garage and closed the door behind him. "No, it's not fine. I heard them talking earlier. Mom was telling people that you work for us? Like, you're hired help or something?" The words hit like a physical blow. I had suspected that Camille had been reshaping the narrative of our living situation, but hearing it confirmed by my own nephew was devastating. "And Dad," Tyler continued, his voice dropping even lower, "Dad was showing Mr. Peterson around the house like it was his. He was talking about his renovation plans for the kitchen and how his investment in the property was paying off." I closed my eyes, fighting back the surge of anger and hurt that threatened to overwhelm me. The kitchen renovation Tyler was referring to, the one Derek was apparently taking credit for, had cost me $43,000 last spring,
money I had earned through countless emergency surgeries and weekend shifts, invested in a home I thought I was sharing with grateful family members. "Tyler, can I ask you something?" I said quietly. "Do you know who actually owns this house?" He looked confused. I I thought Dad did. Mom always talks about our house and our property. But he paused, studying my face. "It's yours, isn't it?" Before I could answer, the garage door burst open and Camille appeared, her face flushed with irritation and wine. She was dressed in the designer cocktail dress I had bought her for her birthday, accessorized with jewelry from the collection that had belonged to our mother, jewelry that should have been split between Derek and me, but had somehow ended up entirely in Camille's possession. "Tyler, what are you doing out here? Our guests are asking about you." "I was just checking on Aunt Natalie," Tyler replied, a note of defiance that I had never heard before. Camille's gaze flicked to me with barely concealed disdain. "Natalie is fine. She prefers quieter settings, don't you, Natalie?" The way she said my name made it sound like she was addressing a misbehaving child rather than a woman who had spent the morning saving a 7-year-old's life in the operating room. "Actually," I said, standing up and brushing dust off my jeans, "I think I'd like to join the dinner after all. It is Thanksgiving, and this is—" "That's really not necessary," Camille cut me off smoothly. "We've already explained to everyone that you're more comfortable with informal arrangements. It would be awkward to change that now." The calculation in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't about my comfort or social preferences. This was about maintaining a carefully constructed fiction that positioned Derek and Camille as the successful, sophisticated homeowners, while I was relegated to the role of the quirky, socially awkward relative who they graciously allowed to live in their space. Tyler looked between us, clearly picking up on the undercurrents of the conversation, even if he didn't fully understand them yet. Besides, Dr. Morrison from the hospital board is here tonight, and we wouldn't want to complicate things by... "By what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "By giving people the wrong impression about our family dynamics," she finished, her smile never wavering, but her eyes hardening. The message was clear. My presence at the dinner table might disrupt whatever narrative they had constructed about their social status and financial success. In their version of events, I was an inconvenience to be managed, not a family member to be celebrated. As Camille ushered Tyler back toward the house, leaving me alone again in the garage, I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app I rarely checked on holidays. But tonight, I needed to see something specific, something that would remind me exactly who I was and what I had built. The screen displayed my investment portfolio, my savings accounts, and, most importantly, the mortgage account for 847 Oakwood Falls, Millbrook Falls, Oregon. Property owner, Dr. Natalie Cross. Purchase date, March 15th, 2018. Outstanding balance, $0.00. Paid in full as of September 2022.
They had no idea that every payment, every renovation, every improvement to their house had come from my surgical practice. They didn't know that the property taxes, the insurance, the utilities, everything was still being paid from my accounts through automatic transfers they had never bothered to question. But most importantly, they had no idea that for the past 6 months, I had been documenting everything. Every conversation, every assumption, every moment where they treated me like hired help in my own home. Not because I was planning anything vindictive, but because I was finally starting to see the situation clearly. And what I saw was that it was time to reclaim my house, my dignity, and my life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
What Derek and Camille didn't understand, what they had never bothered to learn, was exactly who they were treating like hired help in their own dining room. Dr. Natalie Cross wasn't just any surgeon. At 34, she was the youngest department head in Millbrook General Hospital's history, specializing in pediatric cardiac surgery, one of the most demanding and prestigious fields in medicine. Her hands had saved over 300 children's lives, including the mayor's grandson and 2 kids from the Richardson family, who happened to own half the commercial real estate in Millbrook Falls. The irony was suffocating. While Camille was inside explaining to their guests how Natalie was more comfortable in simple settings, those same guests had no idea they were in the presence of someone who routinely performed 8-hour surgeries on infants' hearts, someone whose expertise was sought by hospitals across the Pacific Northwest, someone who had been featured in Medical Journal Quarterly for developing a revolutionary technique that reduced postoperative complications by 40%. Natalie had built her reputation the hard way. Growing up in Millbrook Falls as the younger child of working-class parents, their father a mechanic, their mother a school secretary, she had watched Derek struggle academically while she excelled. When their parents died in a car accident during her medical residency, Derek had inherited their modest childhood home, while Natalie received a small life insurance payout that barely covered her student loans. But Derek's inheritance hadn't lasted long. His attempts at various business ventures, a failed restaurant, an unsuccessful contracting company, a disastrous investment in cryptocurrency, had eaten not only through the house's equity, but also left him with crushing debt. By 2018, foreclosure was imminent. That's when Natalie had stepped in. Fresh from completing her fellowship at Portland Children's Hospital and having just accepted the department head position at Millbrook General, she had purchased a beautiful Victorian home on Oakwood Drive, the kind of house she had dreamed of as a child driving past with her parents. Her plan had been simple: create a sanctuary where she could decompress from the intense pressure of her career, maybe start a family someday, build the stable life that medicine's demanding schedule had always made difficult. The house was perfect. Built in 1924, it featured original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and a spacious kitchen that opened into a dining room designed for large family gatherings. At 4,200 square feet, it was far more space than a single woman needed. But Natalie had fallen in love with its potential. She could envision hosting medical colleagues, creating a warm environment for the family she hoped to have, maybe even converting the third floor into a home office where she could write the research papers that were advancing her field. The property cost her $485,000, nearly every penny she had saved from her residency and fellowship years, plus a mortgage that required her to work additional shifts at the hospital to cover. But it was hers, completely and legally hers, and she had never been prouder of anything in her life. When Derek's financial situation became desperate 6 months after her purchase, Natalie had made what she thought was a temporary, compassionate decision. Derek and Camille needed somewhere to stay while they got back on their feet. Their apartment lease was ending, and Derek's credit was too damaged to qualify for anything decent. As his only family, Natalie felt obligated to help. Just for a few months, Derek had promised, standing in her beautifully appointed entryway with 2 suitcases and a defeated expression. Until I can figure out my next move. Those few months had stretched into 3 years. What should have been a temporary arrangement had gradually transformed into something else entirely. Derek and Camille had moved into the master bedroom. Since we're a couple, we need more space, Camille had reasoned, relegating Natalie to what had been originally her home office. When Tyler started high school and needed stability, it made sense for him to take the third bedroom, leaving Natalie feeling like a guest in her own home. The shifts had been subtle at first, Camille taking over the kitchen because she enjoyed cooking for everyone. Derek handling the yard work and home maintenance because it gives me purpose while I'm looking for work. Gradually, they had assumed the roles of homeowners while Natalie found herself treated more like a helpful relative who contributed to household expenses. But what stung most was how completely they had erased her accomplishments. When neighbors or acquaintances asked about the beautiful home, Derek and Camille spoke about their renovation projects, their decorating choices, their investment in the property. Natalie's achievements, the grueling years of medical school, the competitive residency, the fellowship that required her to work 100-hour weeks, the board certifications, the research publications, all of it became invisible. To make matters worse, Camille had begun introducing Natalie to new people as Derek's sister who helps with childcare, or the live-in nanny, or, most recently, simply, someone who works for us. The fact that Natalie was saving children's lives at the hospital while Camille spent her days shopping and planning social events seemed irrelevant to the narrative Camille was constructing. The financial reality was even more galling. Natalie was still paying the mortgage, all $2,847 per month. She covered the property taxes, the homeowner's insurance, and most of the utilities. Her salary of $340,000 per year as department head was what allowed the family to live in a neighborhood where houses routinely sold for over $500,000. Derek's sporadic freelance consulting work barely covered his car payment, while Camille had never held a job during their entire marriage. Yet somehow, in their version of events, Natalie was the one receiving charity. The breaking point had come 3 weeks earlier, when Natalie overheard Camille on the phone with her mother. "We're doing really well," Camille had said, walking through the living room that Natalie had furnished piece by piece. "Derek's finally getting the recognition he deserves, and we've been able to provide a stable home for Tyler. We even have help with childcare. Derek's sister lives here and takes care of the domestic stuff, so I can focus on my committee work and social obligations." Domestic stuff. As if performing life-saving surgery was equivalent to washing dishes. That night, Natalie had sat in her cramped bedroom, the smallest room in her own house, and made a list. Not a list of grievances or complaints, but a list of facts. Legal facts, financial facts, documented realities that painted a very different picture than the one Derek and Camille had been presenting to the world. The house deed was in her name alone. The mortgage payments came from her accounts. The renovation costs, over $80,000 in improvements since 2018, had been funded entirely by her surgical income. Even the furniture, the artwork, the kitchen appliances that Camille loved to show off to visitors had been purchased with Natalie's money. Most importantly, Natalie realized she had been enabling this situation not out of generosity, but out of a misguided sense of family obligation and, if she was honest with herself, a fear of confrontation that went back to their childhood dynamics. But sitting in that garage on Thanksgiving night, eating leftover turkey while her own guests celebrated in her own dining room, Natalie finally understood something crucial. She wasn't the family embarrassment who needed to be hidden away. She was a successful, accomplished woman who had allowed herself to be diminished by people who had contributed nothing to the life they were claiming as their own. And it was time to remind them exactly who owned what. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Looking back, Natalie could trace the erosion of her position in the house through a series of small, seemingly reasonable requests that had gradually stripped away her authority in her own home. It started with Camille's suggestions about the decor. "You know, Natalie, your taste is very clinical," she had said 6 months after moving in, running her fingers along the modern art pieces Natalie had carefully selected. "This house has such beautiful Victorian bones. It deserves something more warm and traditional, don't you think?" Before Natalie knew it, her contemporary furniture was being relegated to the basement for storage, replaced with Camille's preference for heavy, ornate pieces that made the open spaces feel cramped and dark. The abstract paintings that Natalie loved, pieces she had purchased from local artists whose work spoke to her, disappeared into closets, replaced with generic landscape prints that Camille claimed were more universally appealing. "We want guests to feel comfortable," Camille had explained when Natalie questioned the changes. "Your style is very sophisticated, but it can be intimidating for regular people." Regular people. As if Natalie's education and success somehow disqualified her from having normal human connections. The kitchen had been the next battlefield. Natalie, who barely had time to cook due to her surgical schedule, had initially been grateful when Camille offered to handle meal planning and preparation. But gratitude turned to confusion when Camille began treating the kitchen as her exclusive domain, rearranging everything to suit her preferences and making it clear that Natalie's presence during cooking was unwelcome. "You're always so tired when you get home from the hospital," Camille would say when Natalie attempted to prepare her own meals. "Why don't you just let me handle dinner? You can eat with us, of course, but there's no need for you to worry about the details." Gradually, Natalie found herself asking permission to use appliances she had purchased, apologizing for disrupting Camille's meal prep, feeling like an intruder in the very room where she had imagined hosting dinner parties for her colleagues. The granite countertops she had saved for months to afford, the professional-grade range that had been her one splurge during the renovation, all of it became Camille's territory to command. Even more insidious was how Derek and Camille had begun managing Natalie's social life. When colleagues from the hospital called the house, Camille would often take messages and forget to relay them. When Natalie planned to invite people over, there always seemed to be a conflict. Tyler needed quiet time for studying. Derek was expecting an important business call. Camille had already committed the space for one of her committee meetings. "You work so hard, Natalie," Derek would say with apparent concern. "Maybe it's better if you keep your work life and home life separate. This way you can really relax when you're here." The effect was isolating. Slowly, Natalie's colleagues stopped calling the house. Her invitations to social events became less frequent as people assumed she preferred to keep to herself. The home that was supposed to be her sanctuary became a place where she felt increasingly disconnected from her own life.
The financial manipulation had been perhaps the most sophisticated part of their strategy. When Derek first moved in, he had insisted on contributing to household expenses. "I won't be a burden, Nat. Let me at least help with utilities and groceries." His contributions started at $400 per month, a fraction of the actual costs, but Natalie had appreciated the gesture. Over time, however, Derek began treating this modest payment as if it gave him equal say in household decisions. When Natalie wanted to upgrade the heating system, Derek objected to the expense. When she planned to refinish the hardwood floors, Camille worried about the disruption to our daily routine. Meanwhile, Derek and Camille's expenses mysteriously found their way onto Natalie's credit cards. Emergency car repairs, Tyler's school expenses, Camille's medical appointments. Somehow, Natalie always ended up covering costs that Derek promised to reimburse but never did. When she raised concerns, Derek would become defensive. "I thought we were family, Nat. I thought we supported each other. If you want me to keep a ledger of every penny like some kind of business transaction, I can do that, but it seems pretty cold." The guilt was expertly applied. Natalie, who had spent her career saving other people's children, found it impossible to be cold to her own family, even when that family was systematically taking advantage of her generosity. But the most damaging aspect of the arrangement was how it had affected her relationship with Tyler. At 12, when they moved in, Tyler had initially bonded with his aunt, fascinated by her work at the hospital and proud to tell his friends that his aunt was a surgeon. But as the years passed and his parents' narrative took hold, Tyler's attitude began to shift. Camille was subtle in her campaign. Never direct criticism, just gentle corrections that reshaped Tyler's understanding of family dynamics. When Tyler mentioned how hard Natalie worked, Camille would sigh and say,
Yes, she's very dedicated to her career. Sometimes I worry she doesn't know how to balance work and family. When Tyler expressed interest in medicine, Derek would redirect the conversation. That's a very demanding field, son. It can make people intense. Look how stressed your aunt always is. There are lots of ways to help people without sacrificing your whole life to work. The message was clear. Natalie's dedication to her profession wasn't admirable, it was a character flaw that made her less capable of normal relationships and family connections. The breaking point for Natalie's relationship with Tyler had come during his freshman year of high school. She had offered to help him with a biology project, excited to share her knowledge and spend time with her nephew. But when she sat down with his textbook, Tyler had looked uncomfortable. Actually, Aunt Nat, Mom already said she'd help me. She thinks you might make it too complicated. Too complicated? Her expertise in human anatomy and physiology was too complicated for a high school biology project? That night, Natalie realized that Derek and Camille hadn't just taken over her house. They had systematically undermined her relationships, her authority, and her sense of belonging in her own life. Every decision was filtered through their approval. Every relationship was mediated by their interpretation of what was appropriate or beneficial. She was paying for the privilege of being marginalized in her own home. The most painful realization was that this hadn't been accidental. Derek and Camille hadn't gradually overstepped boundaries due to thoughtlessness or misunderstanding. They had deliberately and systematically positioned themselves as the primary residents while reducing Natalie to the role of a paying guest whose preferences were secondary to their comfort. The evidence was everywhere once she started looking for it. The way they spoke about our house to visitors while referring to Natalie's room as if she were a boarder. The way important household decisions were made between Derek and Camille with Natalie informed after the fact. The way her schedule was expected to accommodate their plans, but their activities took precedence when conflicts arose. Most telling was their reaction when Natalie had tentatively mentioned dating. Dr. James Morrison, a colleague from Portland, had expressed interest in taking her to dinner. When Natalie mentioned the possibility of him visiting, Camille's response was immediate and decisive. "Oh, Natalie, I don't think that's a good idea. Tyler's at such a formative age. We wouldn't want him confused about family dynamics. And Derek's business networking is just starting to gain traction. Having strange men around might send the wrong message to potential clients." The subtext was unmistakable. Natalie's romantic life was a potential disruption to their established order, something to be managed and controlled rather than supported and celebrated. Sitting in that garage on Thanksgiving night, Natalie finally understood that she wasn't living with grateful family members who had temporarily fallen on hard times. She was providing free housing and financial support to people who had systematically erased her identity, authority, and autonomy in her own life for the exchange of their continued presence in her life. And tomorrow, she was going to start documenting exactly how deep this deception ran. The morning after Thanksgiving, Natalie sat in her car in the hospital parking garage at 5:47 a.m., 30 minutes before her shift began. She had left the house while Derek and Camille were still sleeping off their dinner party, unable to face another morning of pretending everything was normal while they discussed their successful evening over coffee in her kitchen. But instead of heading directly into the hospital, she pulled out her phone and opened a new document. At the top, she typed, "Documentation log, November 24th, 2023. Below that, she began writing everything she could remember from the previous evening, not just the garage humiliation, but every detail of how her own family had presented themselves as the homeowners while relegating her to hired help.
The act of writing it down made the situation crystallize in a way that shocked her.
Seeing the facts laid out in black and white without the emotional confusion of being in the moment, Natalie realized she had been unconsciously collecting evidence of their deception for months. Her surgeon's mind, trained to observe and document critical details, had been cataloging inconsistencies even when she hadn't been ready to acknowledge what they meant. 3 hours later, during her break between surgeries, Natalie received a text from Tyler. "Aunt Nat, are you okay? You left really early this morning. Mom said you were probably embarrassed about making a scene last night." Making a scene? According to Camille's version of events, Natalie's quiet request to join the dinner had been inappropriate drama, rather than a reasonable expectation of being included in her own home. Natalie stared at the text for several minutes before responding. "I'm fine, honey. Just had an early surgery. What did your mom mean about me making a scene?" Tyler's response came back quickly. "She said you got upset about the seating arrangements and that Dad had to calm you down. She told everyone this morning that you've been stressed about work lately and sometimes you don't think clearly about social situations." The blatant rewriting of history was breathtaking. In Camille's narrative, Derek had been the peacemaker, trying to manage Natalie's unreasonable behavior, rather than the passive participant in her deliberate exclusion. Even more calculated was the suggestion that Natalie's stress about work, her demanding, life-saving career, made her judgment unreliable in social settings. Natalie immediately added this to her documentation, including screenshots of Tyler's texts. Then she did something she had never done before. She started paying attention to details she had previously dismissed as unimportant. That afternoon, she called her bank to request detailed statements for the past 3 years. As she reviewed the records, patterns emerged that she had been too trusting to notice before. The mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance premiums, and major utility bills all came from her accounts automatically, but scattered throughout were dozens of charges she hadn't made personally. Expensive dinners at restaurants she had never been to, shopping trips to stores she didn't frequent, gas purchases for Derek's truck, even spa appointments under Camille's name. Her credit card statements revealed an even more troubling pattern. In the months after Derek and Camille moved in, there had been a steady stream of charges for household improvements, new furniture, decorative items, appliances, that Natalie had agreed to during casual conversations, but had never realized would appear on her personal credit cards. When she had questioned some of the larger purchases, Derek had always had an explanation. "The old dining room table was really too small for entertaining, and since you're always working, Camille and I thought we'd handle getting something more appropriate. We can discuss reimbursement later, but I figured you'd want us to just take care of it." Later never came. Every promised reimbursement was forgotten, delayed, or dismissed as unnecessary between family members. Meanwhile, Derek and Camille's lifestyle had steadily improved on Natalie's credit, while her own financial security was gradually being eroded by expenses she had never explicitly approved. But the credit card revelations were only the beginning. When Natalie looked closer at her household accounts, she discovered that Derek had been receiving mail at the house for various business ventures she knew nothing about. Using her address, he had opened business banking accounts, applied for small business loans, and even established a credit line that listed him as a resident of the property. The implications were staggering. Derek was using her address and, by extension, her homeownership status to establish credit and business legitimacy. To banks and creditors, it would appear that Derek was a stable property owner rather than someone with a history of financial failure who was actually living rent-free in his sister's house. That evening, Natalie decided to test her growing suspicions. Instead of retreating to her room as she usually did after work, she sat in the living room with her laptop, ostensibly catching up on medical journals, but actually listening to Derek and Camille's conversation in the kitchen. "Dr. Morrison from the hospital board seemed impressed with the house last night," Camille was saying as she loaded the dishwasher with plates Natalie had purchased. "He mentioned that his wife is looking for someone to chair the Children's Hospital fundraising committee. I think I made a good impression."
That's perfect, Derek replied. Between your committee work and my consulting clients, we're really establishing ourselves in the community. Did you mention the renovation plans for the master bathroom? Natalie's blood ran cold. There were no renovation plans for the master bathroom, at least none that she was aware of. But Derek and Camille were apparently discussing home improvements as if they were the decision makers and financial providers. I showed Morrison the sketches, Camille continued. He was very impressed with our vision for the space. I told him we're planning to start construction in the spring, once Derek's consulting contracts are finalized. Sketches? Construction? Natalie quietly opened her banking app and checked her savings account balance. She had $47,000 set aside for emergency expenses, money she had been carefully accumulating in case of medical equipment failures or unexpected hospital issues. If Derek and Camille were planning bathroom renovations, they were apparently assuming those funds would be available for their use.
The conversation continued, but Natalie had heard enough. She retreated to her room and spent the next hour researching property ownership laws in Oregon. What she discovered was both reassuring and terrifying. As the sole owner of the property, she had complete legal authority to determine who lived there and under what conditions. But she also learned that establishing tenancy rights could be complex, especially when family members had been residing in the property for an extended period. More disturbing was the discovery that Derek's business activities using her address could potentially create legal complications. If his ventures failed and creditors came looking for assets, her property could theoretically be at risk, depending on how the business relationships had been structured. The next morning, Natalie made 2 phone calls during her lunch break. The first was to a real estate attorney named Patricia Fleming, who specialized in property disputes. The second was to a private investigator named Marcus Reed, who had been recommended by a colleague who had gone through a difficult divorce. Attorney Fleming's initial consultation was brief but illuminating. Based on what you're describing, Dr. Cross, it sounds like your brother and sister-in-law may be engaging in what we call adverse possession behavior, essentially acting as if they have ownership rights they don't legally possess. The business activities using your address are particularly concerning. Fleming recommended that Natalie begin documenting everything: financial transactions, living arrangements, decision-making patterns, and any evidence of Derek and Camille presenting themselves as homeowners to third parties. The private investigator, Marcus Reed, was even more direct. You wouldn't be the first successful person to discover that family members have been systematically exploiting their generosity, he said during their phone consultation. The good news is that if they're being deceptive with you, they're probably being deceptive with others too. Deception leaves trails. Reed outlined a plan for investigating Derek's business activities, Camille's social claims, and their financial situation. If they're living beyond their actual means while presenting themselves as property owners, there will be evidence. Bank records, credit applications, social media posts, public statements. People who are constructing false narratives usually can't keep their stories consistent across all platforms. That night, as Natalie lay in her small bedroom listening to Derek and Camille discuss their plans for hosting Christmas dinner in her house for guests they would invite, using her money for expenses they would incur, she realized that the Thanksgiving garage incident hadn't been an isolated moment of thoughtlessness. It had been the culmination of a long-term strategy to reposition her as a dependent in her own home, setting the stage for something even more ambitious than she had initially imagined. And now she was going to find out exactly what that something was. 2 weeks after hiring Marcus Reed, Natalie sat in a coffee shop across town from the hospital, staring at a manila folder that contained information she wasn't sure she was prepared to read. The private investigator had been thorough, perhaps more thorough than she had anticipated when she first asked him to look into Derek and Camille's activities. "Before you open that," Reed said, sliding into the booth across from her, "I need to prepare you for what you're going to find. This isn't just about them living in your house or taking advantage of your generosity. What your brother and sister-in-law have been doing is significantly more sophisticated and potentially criminal than we initially suspected. Natalie's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. The first document was a credit report for Derek Cross, run using his social security number, but listing her address as his primary residence for the past 3 years. According to the report, Derek had opened 17 different lines of credit during that time period, including business loans, personal credit cards, and even a home equity line of credit that somehow used her property as collateral. "How is this possible?" Natalie whispered, flipping through page after page of financial products she had never authorized. "I never signed anything. I never gave permission for any of this." Reed pulled out a tablet and opened a digital folder containing dozens of photographs. "That's where it gets interesting. Your brother has been forging your signature on financial documents for over 2 years. We have evidence of at least 12 instances where he signed your name to loan applications, credit agreements, and property-related paperwork." The photographs showed documents that made Natalie's stomach drop. Loan applications for Derek's various business ventures that listed her as a co-signer, property insurance modifications that added Camille as an additional homeowner, even a mortgage refinancing application that would have put Derek's name on the deed alongside hers, an application that had been rejected by the bank, but only because Derek's credit history was too poor to qualify. The mortgage refinancing attempt was the most ambitious. If it had been approved, Derek would have gained legal ownership of 50% of your property. The monthly payments would have increased by nearly $800, all coming from your accounts, but Derek would have had legal standing to make decisions about the property, including the right to sell it. Natalie felt nauseous. When did this happen? 8 months ago, right around the time you mentioned they started talking about major renovations. According to the bank records, Derek presented himself as your business partner who was formalizing his investment in the property. He had documentation showing regular payments into your household accounts, payments that, when we traced them back, came from credit cards that were opened using your address and credit history. The implications were staggering. Derek had been using Natalie's financial standing to obtain credit, then using that credit to make token payments that he could present as evidence of his legitimate investment in the property. It was a circular scheme that made him appear to be a contributing partner while actually increasing Natalie's debt burden.
But the financial fraud was only the beginning. The folder contained social media screenshots that revealed how extensively Derek and Camille had been misrepresenting their living situation to friends, potential business contacts, and the broader community. Camille's Facebook page was filled with photos of our beautiful home, showing off rooms that Natalie had designed and furnished. Dinner parties were described as events that Derek and I hosted, with Natalie either absent from photos or relegated to background shots that made her appear to be a guest rather than the homeowner. Most painfully, there were multiple posts about the wonderful help we have with Tyler, referring to Natalie as if she were hired childcare rather than the boy's aunt. Derek's LinkedIn profile was even more brazen. He listed his address as Cross Family Residence and described himself as a property development consultant specializing in residential renovations. His profile included before and after photos of Natalie's house, presenting the improvements she had funded as examples of his professional work. Several potential clients had contacted him specifically because they were impressed with the renovations shown in his portfolio. Your brother has been using your property as a showpiece to attract consulting clients, Reed explained. He's been giving tours of the house to prospective customers, presenting the kitchen renovation, the refinished floors, and the landscaping as examples of his expertise. According to bank records, he's collected over $23,000 in consulting fees from clients who hired him based on work that you paid for. The betrayal went deeper than Natalie had imagined.
Derek wasn't just living rent-free in her house. He was actively profiting from her investments while positioning himself as the creative and financial force behind the property's improvements. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was evidence of Derek and Camille's long-term plans. Reed had obtained copies of emails between the couple and a real estate agent named Jennifer Walsh, discussing the potential sale value of the Oakwood Drive property. "They've been getting the house appraised," Reed said, pulling out printed emails that made Natalie's blood run cold. According to these communications, they told the real estate agent that they were considering selling due to a potential job relocation. The agent provided them with a market analysis showing the property's current value at $687,000. Natalie stared at the number. In the 5 years since she had purchased the house, her investments in renovations and improvements, combined with the strong real estate market, had increased the property's value by over $200,000, money that Derek and Camille were apparently planning to claim as their own. The emails revealed more details of their scheme. Derek had told the real estate agent that he and Camille owned the property jointly with his sister, describing Natalie as a silent partner who had provided some of the initial investment but wasn't involved in day-to-day decisions about the property. When the agent asked about the deed and ownership structure, Derek had promised to provide documentation clarifying the financial arrangements. They were planning to forge additional documents to support their ownership claims, Reed concluded. The real estate agent's notes indicate that Derek scheduled a follow-up meeting to provide proof of his ownership stake. That meeting was supposed to happen next week. The final section of the folder contained the most chilling evidence: recorded conversations. Reed had obtained audio from several sources, including Derek's business meetings and social gatherings, where he and Camille had discussed their living situation with remarkable candor. In one recording, captured during a neighborhood barbecue, Derek described Natalie as brilliant with medical stuff, but totally clueless about real-world finances and social situations. He explained to a neighbor that he and Camille had stepped in to help her manage the property because her demanding career left her no time for household responsibilities. "She's incredibly generous," Derek had said on the recording, "but she just doesn't understand how to present herself or the property appropriately. Camille and I have really helped her establish a more sophisticated lifestyle." Another recording from one of Camille's charity committee meetings was even more devastating. Camille had described Natalie as a workaholic who basically hired us to manage her domestic life. She explained that they lived in Natalie's house because she needed our help creating a real home environment, and we needed temporary housing while Derek's business was getting established. It's worked out perfectly for everyone. In Camille's version of events, they weren't taking advantage of Natalie's generosity. They were providing a valuable service that she was paying for because she couldn't manage her personal life independently. But the most damaging recording was from a conversation between Derek and a potential business partner. Derek had described the house as our family property and mentioned that he was considering restructuring the ownership situation to better reflect his and Camille's contributions to the property's value. "My sister's great, but she's not really the homeowner type. She's more comfortable when other people handle the social and financial aspects of property management. We're looking at formalizing an arrangement that recognizes our investment and ongoing management responsibilities." Reed closed the tablet and leaned back in his chair. "Dr. Cross, what your brother and sister-in-law have been planning isn't just exploitation, it's systematic financial fraud with the ultimate goal of stealing your property. If they had succeeded in their refinancing scheme, or if they had managed to convince a court that they had legitimate ownership claims based on their financial contributions and management role, you could have lost your house entirely."
Natalie sat in stunned silence, absorbing the full scope of Derek and Camille's deception. This wasn't a case of family members taking advantage of her generosity or gradually overstepping boundaries. This was a coordinated, long-term plan to systematically transfer ownership of her property and assets
to themselves, while maintaining the fiction that they were helping her. And according to the timeline Reed had constructed, they were preparing to execute the final phase of their plan within the next few months. The Monday morning after her meeting with Marcus Reed, Natalie found herself in attorney Patricia Fleming's downtown office, surrounded by legal documents that would fundamentally change her life. But for the first time in months, she felt a sense of clarity and control that had been absent since Derek and Camille moved into her house. "The evidence your investigator has gathered is extraordinary," Fleming said, spreading the documents across her mahogany conference table. "In 15 years of property law, I've rarely seen fraud this systematic and well-documented. Your brother didn't just cross ethical boundaries, he committed multiple felonies that carry serious prison time." Fleming had spent the weekend reviewing Reed's findings and consulting with colleagues who specialized in financial fraud. The legal strategy she proposed was comprehensive and surgical, designed to protect Natalie's assets while ensuring that Derek and Camille faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. "The forged signatures alone constitute identity theft and wire fraud," Fleming explained, pointing to copies of the loan applications. "But the attempted mortgage refinancing and the business ventures using your property as collateral elevate this to federal crimes. The FBI has a dedicated unit for financial fraud cases exactly like this." Natalie absorbed this information with the same focused attention she brought to complex surgical procedures. "What's our timeline?" Reed mentioned they're planning to meet with the real estate agent next week. "That actually works in our favor," Fleming replied. "We want them to take the next step in their scheme. The more they commit to this course of action, the stronger our case becomes. But we need to position ourselves carefully so that when they make their move, we're ready to respond immediately." Fleming outlined a 3-phase plan that would unfold over the next month. Phase 1 involved securing Natalie's assets and legal position without alerting Derek and Camille to the investigation. This meant placing protective holds on the property deed, freezing the fraudulent credit accounts, and preparing emergency restraining orders that could be activated if necessary. "We're also going to set up surveillance. Your brother's meeting with the real estate agent will be recorded, and we'll have investigators present to document any false statements he makes about property ownership. The more evidence we gather of them actively defrauding potential buyers or lenders, the stronger our criminal case becomes." Phase 2 would involve coordinating with federal investigators. Fleming had already reached out to the FBI's white-collar crime division, and they were interested in pursuing charges. Derek's pattern of using forged documents to obtain credit, combined with his business fraud and identity theft, made this exactly the kind of case that federal prosecutors wanted to pursue aggressively. "The federal involvement is crucial," Fleming explained, "because it means Derek and Camille can't simply pay restitution and walk away. Financial fraud at this level typically results in significant prison time, especially when it involves family members and abuse of trust." But it was Phase 3 that would provide Natalie with the personal satisfaction she craved, the complete legal and social reckoning that would expose Derek and Camille's deception to everyone they had manipulated. "We're going to coordinate the revelation of their fraud with maximum impact," Fleming said with a slight smile. "Your brother has been using your property to attract business clients, and your sister-in-law has been leveraging the house to gain social standing. When their deception is exposed, it won't just affect their legal situation, it will destroy their professional and social credibility entirely." Fleming had already identified key targets for this exposure: Derek's consulting clients who had hired him based on work he hadn't actually done, Camille's charity committees where she had gained influence by presenting herself as a successful homeowner, and the broader social network that had accepted their version of the living arrangement. "The beauty of their scheme," Fleming noted, "is that they've documented their own deception so thoroughly. Every social media post, every business presentation, every conversation where they claimed ownership of your property becomes evidence of their fraud. They've essentially created a comprehensive record of their own crimes." While Fleming handled the legal strategy, Natalie worked with Reed to develop the personal aspects of her response. This wasn't just about legal consequences. It was about reclaiming her life and ensuring that Derek and Camille could never manipulate her or anyone else in the same way again. Reed had identified several key relationships that needed to be addressed carefully. Tyler, now 16, had been living under Derek and Camille's version of events for 3 years. Exposing Derek and Camille's fraud would be traumatic for him, but allowing him to continue believing their lies would be equally damaging in the long term. We need to approach Tyler separately from his parents, Reed advised. He's old enough to understand the financial and legal realities, and based on his text messages and behavior, he's already questioning some of his parents' explanations. If we present the evidence properly, he'll likely be relieved to finally understand what's really been happening. Reed had also identified several key family friends and community members who had been inadvertently supporting Derek and Camille's deception. Dr. Morrison from the hospital board, who had been impressed with their house during the Thanksgiving dinner, needed to understand that he had been misled about who actually owned the property and made the improvements he had admired.
The social exposure is almost as important as the legal consequences, Reed explained. Derek and Camille have built their entire social identity around lies about their financial success and property ownership. When that foundation crumbles, they won't be able to rebuild in this community. But perhaps the most important element of the plan was ensuring Natalie's own protection and future security. Fleming had recommended a series of legal safeguards that would prevent anyone from exploiting her generosity in the future. "We're going to establish a formal trust structure for your property," Fleming explained. "This will make it legally impossible for anyone else to claim ownership rights or use the property as collateral without your explicit written consent. We're also implementing financial monitoring systems that will alert you immediately if anyone attempts to use your identity or address for credit applications." These protections extended beyond just financial fraud. Fleming recommended restraining orders that would prevent Derek and Camille from contacting Natalie's colleagues, patients, or professional associates. Given their pattern of manipulation and deception, we want to ensure they can't attempt to damage your medical career or professional reputation as retaliation for exposing their crimes. The comprehensive nature of the plan was both reassuring and overwhelming. Natalie would emerge from this situation with complete legal protection, full documentation of Derek and Camille's crimes, and the satisfaction of seeing them face appropriate consequences. But she would also be essentially severing ties with the only family she had left. "Are you prepared for the personal cost of this approach?" Fleming asked gently. "Once we implement this plan, there will be no possibility of reconciliation with your brother. He and Camille will face federal charges, possible prison time, and complete social and professional disgrace. There's no going back from that level of consequence." Natalie considered the question while looking out Fleming's office window at the city she had worked so hard to build a life in. 3 years ago, she had thought she was providing temporary help to family members in need. Now she understood that she had been systematically defrauded by people who viewed her success as something to be exploited rather than respected. "They made their choice when they decided to forge my signature and steal my property. I'm not destroying their lives. I'm protecting myself from people who have already demonstrated they're willing to commit serious crimes at my expense." Fleming nodded approvingly. "In that case, we begin implementing Phase 1 tomorrow. By Christmas, Derek and Camille will understand exactly what they've been trying to steal and exactly what it's going to cost them." That evening, Natalie sat in her small bedroom, the room she had been relegated to in her own house, and began preparing for the most important performance of her life. For the next few weeks, she would need to continue acting as if nothing had changed, while carefully positioning herself for the moment when Derek and Camille's world would collapse around them. She was no longer the naive, generous sister who could be manipulated through guilt and family obligation. She was a successful surgeon who had built everything they were trying to steal, and she was about to remind them exactly who they had been foolish enough to cross. 2 weeks before Christmas,
Natalie implemented the most crucial phase of her plan. It began with a conversation that Derek and Camille would later realize was the moment their carefully constructed world began to unravel, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than Natalie finally embracing their version of family dynamics. "I've been thinking about what Camille said at Thanksgiving," Natalie announced over breakfast, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate casualness. Derek looked up from his newspaper, a subscription that appeared on Natalie's credit card statement each month, while Camille paused in her elaborate morning skincare routine that took place at the kitchen island. "I think you're both right. I've been so focused on work that I haven't really contributed to making this house a proper home. I'd like to change that." The relief on their faces was immediate and telling. For months, they had been maneuvering to position Natalie as the grateful recipient of their domestic management rather than the homeowner subsidizing their lifestyle. Her apparent acceptance of this dynamic was exactly what they had been working toward. "That's wonderful, Natalie," Camille said, her voice taking on the patronizing warmth she used when explaining obvious social truths to her socially awkward sister-in-law. "I think you'll find that stepping back from trying to control every aspect of the household will actually be quite liberating for you." "Exactly," Derek agreed, folding his paper with satisfaction. "You've got enough stress at the hospital. Let us handle the domestic stuff. We're good at it, and it gives us a way to contribute while my consulting business builds momentum." Natalie nodded earnestly, playing her role perfectly. "I was actually thinking we should make this arrangement more official, maybe drop some kind of formal agreement about household responsibilities and financial contributions." The suggestion sent a visible thrill through both Derek and Camille. A formal agreement would legitimize their position in ways they had been dreaming about but dared not to request directly. Over the next hour, she guided them through a conversation that would have been impossible just months earlier. Derek and Camille, believing they had finally worn down Natalie's resistance to their management of the household, spoke with unprecedented honesty about how they viewed the living arrangement. "The thing is," Camille explained, "you're brilliant at your job, but running a household, especially one where we entertain and maintain social connections, requires different skills. I have experience with event planning, interior design, social networking. Derek understands property management and home improvement. We bring expertise that complements your medical career." Derek nodded enthusiastically. "Think of it as a partnership where everyone contributes their strengths. You provide the financial stability through your career, and we provide the domestic and social management that makes this house a real home." Natalie took careful notes, documenting their descriptions of the arrangement for future reference. "So you see yourselves as equal partners in the household, even though the financial contributions are different?" "Absolutely," Derek confirmed. "Money isn't the only way to contribute to a family situation. The time and energy Camille puts into managing this house, the networking I do that benefits all of us, the stability we provide for Tyler, all of that has real value." As the conversation continued, Derek and Camille revealed details about their future plans that exceeded even Marcus Reed's investigations. They had been in contact with several contractors about major renovations, presenting themselves as the homeowners and decision-makers. Camille had already scheduled meetings with interior designers for the spring, planning a complete redecoration that would better reflect our family's evolved tastes. Most significantly, Derek casually mentioned that he had been exploring options for formalizing our investment in the property. "What kind of formalization?" Natalie asked, innocently. "Well, legal recognition of the partnership, maybe adjusting the deed to reflect everyone's contributions, or establishing some kind of equity sharing arrangement. Nothing complicated, just something that acknowledges the reality of how we've been functioning as a family." Natalie nodded thoughtfully, as if this was the first time she had considered such arrangements. "That sounds reasonable. Have you looked into what that would involve legally?" Derek's enthusiasm was unmistakable. "I've had some preliminary conversations with real estate professionals. There are several ways to structure these kinds of family partnerships. The key is finding an approach that recognizes everyone's contributions fairly."
What Derek didn't mention was that his preliminary conversations had included meetings with lawyers about adverse possession claims and discussions with financial advisors about leveraging the property's equity for additional business investments. The setup phase of Natalie's plan required one more crucial element: ensuring that Derek and Camille would commit to their scheme publicly and irrevocably. This meant encouraging them to take actions that would create undeniable evidence of their intent to defraud her. "You know what?" Natalie said, appearing to have a sudden inspiration. "Since we're talking about formalizing things, maybe we should have a proper family meeting with professional advice. Get everything documented properly so there are no misunderstandings later." "That's a great idea," Camille agreed immediately. "I know an excellent real estate attorney who could help us structure everything appropriately." Derek nodded eagerly. "And we should probably get a current appraisal of the property, just so everyone understands the values we're working with." Natalie spent the rest of the morning appearing to embrace their suggestions while secretly coordinating with Patricia Fleming and Marcus Reed. Every proposal Derek and Camille made was being recorded, documented, and prepared as evidence for the criminal investigation that would begin the moment they attempted to implement their plans. That afternoon, while Derek was out meeting with potential consulting clients and Camille was at her charity committee meeting, Natalie had a private conversation with Tyler. The 16-year-old had been watching the morning's discussion with visible confusion, clearly struggling to reconcile his parents' version of events with his own observations about the household dynamics. "Tyler, can I ask you something?" Natalie said, finding him in his room working on homework. "Do you understand how the financial arrangements work in this house?" Tyler looked uncomfortable. I mean, I know you pay for a lot of stuff because you make more money, but Mom and Dad always say they contribute in other ways. What do you think about the idea of them becoming legal co-owners of the house?" Tyler's expression shifted to something approaching alarm. "Wait, they're not owners now? I thought Mom always talks about our house and our property. She's been telling people at school functions that Dad designed the renovations and that they're planning major improvements." The revelation that Camille had been misrepresenting the situation to Tyler's school community added another layer to the documentation Natalie was building. But more importantly, Tyler's reaction confirmed what she had suspected, that despite 3 years of his parents' propaganda, he retained enough critical thinking to recognize that something didn't add up about their claims. "Tyler, would you be willing to help me understand exactly what your parents have been telling people about our living situation? Not to get them in trouble, but because I'm trying to figure out how to handle things fairly." Over the next hour, Tyler revealed the full extent of Derek and Camille's social deception. They had been presenting themselves as successful homeowners throughout Tyler's school community, taking credit for Natalie's achievements and using the house as evidence of their financial stability. Several of Tyler's friends' parents had hired Derek for consulting work specifically because they were impressed with his home renovation portfolio. Most disturbing was the revelation that Derek and Camille had been discussing plans to help Aunt Natalie transition to a more appropriate living situation once Tyler graduated from high school. In their version of events, Natalie would eventually move to a smaller apartment better suited for her single lifestyle, while they would purchase the family home and continue building their life in the community they had helped establish. "They've been talking about it like it's already decided," Tyler said quietly. "Like you've agreed to it, but just haven't announced it yet." That evening, as Derek and Camille discussed their successful day, Derek had secured another consulting contract, and Camille had been asked to chair the hospital auxiliary spring fundraiser. Natalie realized that they were no longer just taking advantage of her generosity. They had fully committed to a future that required stealing her property and destroying her life to achieve their goals. The time for subtle documentation and careful evidence gathering was over. Derek and Camille had revealed their complete plan, committed to timelines for implementing it, and involved third parties in their scheme. Tomorrow, Natalie would begin the final phase of her response, and Derek and Camille would learn what happened when you tried to steal from someone who had spent years mastering the art of precision under pressure. The first crack in Derek and Camille's carefully constructed facade came from an unexpected source, Dr. James Morrison from the hospital board. the same man who had been impressed with their house during the Thanksgiving dinner where Natalie had been exiled to the garage. It was a Tuesday morning when Morrison approached Natalie in the hospital corridor, his expression troubled. "Dr. Cross, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I received some rather confusing information yesterday that I hoped you could clarify." Natalie paused, her surgical scrub still damp from a successful 4-hour operation on a newborn with a complex heart defect. "Of course, Dr. Morrison. What can I help you with?" "Well, it's about your family's beautiful home. My wife, Judith, has been working with your sister-in-law, Camille, on the Children's Hospital fundraiser, and yesterday Camille mentioned that she and your brother are planning to sell the property and relocate to Portland for business opportunities." Natalie kept her expression carefully neutral. "I see. The thing is," Morrison continued, lowering his voice, "Judith was interested in potentially making an offer on the house before it goes on the market. She asked me to reach out to you as a courtesy, since we work together. But when she mentioned this to Camille, your sister-in-law seemed surprised that Judith would contact you about it." The implication was clear. Camille had been discussing the sale of the house as if she and Derek were the sole decision-makers, with no mention of Natalie's involvement or consent. "Dr. Cross," Natalie said, carefully, "I think there may be some confusion about the ownership situation. The house is actually in my name alone. Derek and Camille have been living with me for the past 3 years, but they don't have any legal ownership stake in the property." Morrison's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Oh, oh, Dr. Cross, I think there may be a significant misunderstanding here. Camille has been presenting herself as the homeowner to the entire fundraising committee. She's been using the house as credentials for her committee position, describing herself as an experienced property owner and community leader." That afternoon, Natalie received a phone call from Judith Morrison herself. The conversation revealed the full extent of Camille's deception within the hospital auxiliary community. "I'm so embarrassed, Dr. Cross," Judith said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Camille has been soliciting donations for the Children's Hospital fundraiser by hosting events at what she described as her family estate. She's collected over $15,000 in donations at gatherings in your home, presenting herself as the hostess and primary organizer." Natalie felt her stomach drop. Not only had Camille been using her house to gain social standing, but she had been actively fundraising using the property as a prop, potentially creating legal complications around charitable fraud. "There's more," Judith continued. "Camille has been telling people that she's planning to make a major donation to the hospital's new pediatric wing, a donation that would be significant enough to have a room named after her family. She's been taking credit for financial generosity that I now realize was never hers to promise." The conversation with Judith Morrison was the first domino in what would become an avalanche of revelations from people who had been inadvertently supporting Derek and Camille's deception. By Thursday, Natalie had received calls from 3 of Derek's consulting clients who had discovered inconsistencies in his credentials and portfolio. The renovations he had presented as examples of his work didn't match public records, and when they tried to verify his experience, they found gaps and contradictions in his professional history. "Mr. Cross showed us before and after photos of a kitchen renovation that he claimed to have designed and managed," explained Rebecca Santos, who had hired Derek to renovate her family's bathroom. "But our contractor, when looked at the work, said the quality and techniques were professional grade, far beyond what a typical consultant would have access to. We started asking questions." Santos had done her own investigation, discovering that the kitchen renovation Derek claimed credit for had actually been completed by licensed contractors whom Derek had never worked with. When she confronted Derek about the discrepancy, he had become defensive and evasive, ultimately admitting that his role had been more consultative than hands-on. "We're not just disappointed about the misrepresentation," Santos continued. "We're concerned that Mr. Cross may have been systematically misleading clients about his qualifications and experience. Several of us are considering filing complaints with the Better Business Bureau." But it was Tyler who provided the most damaging revelation about his parents' deception. On Friday evening, he approached Natalie with a troubled expression and a manila folder containing documents he had discovered in Derek's home office. "Aunt Nat, I think my parents are planning something really bad. I found these papers in Dad's desk, and I don't think they're legal."
The folder contained drafts of documents that made Natalie's blood run cold. A forged power of attorney that would give Derek authority to make financial decisions on Natalie's behalf. A fraudulent property deed that listed Derek and Camille as co-owners. And most chilling, a fake living will that suggested Natalie had requested Derek to handle her affairs due to increasing mental instability caused by work-related stress. "There's more," Tyler said, pulling out his phone. "I recorded Dad talking to someone yesterday. I think it was a lawyer, but I'm not sure." The recording, captured on Tyler's phone during a conversation Derek thought was private, revealed the full scope of their criminal intent. Derek was discussing strategies for having Natalie declared mentally incompetent, allowing him to assume legal guardianship and control over her assets. "She's been exhibiting signs of stress-related mental decline for months," Derek's voice explained on the recording. "Paranoid behavior, social withdrawal, inability to manage household responsibilities. Her work schedule has become increasingly erratic, and she's been making irrational financial decisions." The voice on the other end of the call, presumably a lawyer Derek was consulting, asked about documentation of these alleged mental health issues. "We have witnesses who can testify to her declining social functioning. Her sister-in-law has been documenting incidents of inappropriate behavior, and several family friends have expressed concern about her ability to live independently." Natalie listened to the recording with a mixture of rage and clinical fascination. Derek and Camille weren't just planning to steal her property. They were planning to have her declared mentally incompetent so they could assume complete control over her life and assets. Tyler's betrayal of his parents' scheme represented more than just evidence gathering. It was a 16-year-old's recognition that what his parents were planning was fundamentally wrong, regardless of whatever justifications they had provided. "I know they're my parents, but what they're planning to do to you, it's not right. And I've been thinking about all the things they've been saying about you, about how you're not capable of managing your own life. But you're a surgeon. You save kids' lives every day. How could you not be capable of managing your own house?" Tyler's support provided Natalie with something she hadn't realized she needed: validation from within her own family that Derek and Camille's treatment of her was not only wrong, but transparently manipulative to anyone paying attention. But perhaps the most significant ally emerged from an unexpected quarter. Detective Angela Torres from the Millbrook Falls Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Torres had been contacted by Marcus Reed as part of the expanding investigation into Derek's fraudulent activities. "Dr. Cross, what your brother and sister-in-law have been doing goes far beyond simple family dispute territory. We're looking at identity theft, financial fraud, forgery, and potentially conspiracy to commit elder abuse." The detective explained that Derek's pattern of behavior fit profiles they had seen in other cases of family financial exploitation. The systematic nature of the deception, the long-term planning, the attempts to isolate you from your professional and social support networks, these are classic indicators of predatory family members who view successful relatives as resources to be exploited, rather than people to be respected. The detective's validation was particularly important because it reframed Derek and Camille's behavior in legal terms rather than personal ones. This wasn't about family dysfunction or misunderstandings. It was about criminal behavior that warranted prosecution regardless of the family relationships involved. The evidence your investigator has gathered, combined with the testimony from community members who were deceived by your brother and sister-in-law, gives us everything we need to pursue serious charges. But we need to coordinate the timing carefully. If they realize they are under investigation, they might accelerate their plans or attempt to destroy evidence. As Natalie left the police station that evening, she realized that Derek and Camille's deception had been so extensive and brazen that it had created its own network of people who had been harmed by their lies. From hospital colleagues to business clients to charity organizations, Derek and Camille had left a trail of manipulation that was now collapsing under its own weight. The allies emerging to support Natalie weren't just motivated by friendship or professional courtesy. They were people who had been personally deceived and who wanted to ensure that Derek and Camille faced consequences for their systematic dishonesty. Tomorrow, that coalition of supporters would help Natalie implement the final phase of her plan, and Derek and Camille would discover that their carefully constructed lies had made enemies of everyone whose trust they had exploited. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made everything feel sharp and decisive. Natalie had spent the weekend finalizing the coordination between Patricia Fleming, Detective Torres, and the federal investigators who would be handling Derek's financial crimes. Today would mark the beginning of the systematic dismantling of everything Derek and Camille had built on lies. The first domino fell at exactly 9:47 a.m. when Derek received a phone call from his largest consulting client, Henderson Development Corporation. Marcus Reed had ensured that Henderson's CEO, Richard Palmer, would receive a detailed dossier of Derek's fraudulent credentials at the start of the business week. Natalie was in the kitchen preparing coffee when Derek answered the call, his voice initially confident and professional. "Good morning, Mr. Palmer. I hope you had a good weekend."
She watched Derek's expression change as Palmer apparently explained why he was calling. The color drained from Derek's face as he listened to what was clearly a thorough recitation of his misrepresentations about his qualifications, experience, and the work portfolio he had claimed as his own. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Derek said, his voice rising slightly. "The projects I showed you are legitimate examples of work I've been involved with. If there's been some confusion about my specific role..." Palmer's response was apparently cutting enough to make Derek fall silent for nearly 30 seconds before attempting another defense. "Mr. Palmer, I can provide additional documentation to clarify my involvement in those renovations. There may have been some miscommunication about the scope of my responsibilities, but I assure you that my work on your project has been completely professional and accurate." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Derek's voice becoming increasingly strained as he tried to explain away evidence that was apparently comprehensive and undeniable. When he finally hung up, Derek stood motionless in the kitchen for several minutes, staring at his phone. "Everything okay?" Natalie asked with carefully calibrated concern. "Some kind of misunderstanding with a client," Derek muttered, already dialing another number. "Someone's been spreading false information about my background. I need to do some damage control." But the damage control efforts only accelerated the collapse. Derek's second phone call was to another client who had apparently received similar information about his fraudulent qualifications. By noon, Derek had fielded 6 calls from clients, business associates, and potential partners who had been provided with evidence of his systematic misrepresentation of his experience and credentials. The most devastating call came from Jennifer Walsh, the real estate agent Derek had been working with to sell the family property. Walsh had received a package of documents that morning that included copies of the property deed showing Natalie as the sole owner, evidence of Derek's forged signatures on various financial documents, and recordings of Derek presenting himself as the homeowner to potential buyers. "Mr. Cross," Walsh's voice was cold and professional when she called, "I need to inform you that Henderson Real Estate will no longer be providing you with any services. The documentation I received this morning indicates that you have been systematically misrepresenting your ownership of the Oakwood Drive property and that you may have committed fraud in your interactions with our agency." Derek's attempts to explain or defend himself were met with Walsh's calm recitation of legal facts.
Mr. Cross, impersonating a property owner for the purpose of initiating a real estate transaction is a felony under Oregon state law. I am required to report this incident to both the State Real Estate Commission and local law enforcement. I strongly advise you to consult with an attorney immediately. That afternoon, while Derek was frantically making phone calls trying to contain the damage to his consulting business, Camille received her own professional reckoning. The Children's Hospital Auxiliary had called an emergency meeting to discuss irregularities in the recent fundraising activities that Camille had been coordinating. Natalie learned about Camille's confrontation from Judith Morrison, who called that evening to provide an update on the auxiliary's investigation. It was quite dramatic, Judith reported. Camille arrived at the meeting expecting to discuss plans for the spring fundraiser, but instead found herself facing questions about the $15,000 in donations she had collected using your house as a venue. The auxiliary board had conducted their own investigation after Judith raised questions about Camille's representations of her living situation. They discovered that Camille had not only misrepresented herself as a homeowner, but had also been using the auxiliary's tax-exempt status to collect donations that she then deposited into a personal account rather than the hospital's official fundraising accounts. The most damaging revelation, Judith continued, was that Camille had been promising major donors that she would match their contributions from her family foundation. Of course, there is no family foundation, and she had no ability to make matching donations. Several donors who gave significant amounts based on her promises are now threatening legal action. The hospital auxiliary had immediately suspended Camille from all activities and reported the financial irregularities to both the hospital's administration and the State Charity Commission. More seriously, they had discovered that Camille's fundraising activities using Natalie's house without proper authorization had created potential liability issues for both the hospital and the donors who had attended events under false premises. Camille tried to claim that there had been miscommunications about her family's financial situation, but the board had too much evidence of deliberate misrepresentation. She's been banned from all future auxiliary activities, and the hospital is considering whether to pursue criminal charges for charity fraud. By Wednesday, the professional destruction of Derek and Camille's reputations had reached a critical mass. Derek's consulting business had effectively collapsed overnight as word spread through the Millbrook Falls business community about his fraudulent credentials and misrepresentation of his experience. 3 former clients had filed complaints with the Better Business Bureau, and 2 were pursuing legal action for breach of contract and fraud. Camille's expulsion from the hospital auxiliary had created ripple effects throughout her social network. The other charity organizations where she had held positions were conducting their own reviews of her activities, and several had already quietly asked her to step down from committee roles pending the resolution of the hospital situation. But the most significant development came from Detective Torres, who called Natalie on Wednesday evening with an update on the criminal investigation. "We executed search warrants on your brother's business accounts today. What we found exceeded our expectations. Derek has been running multiple fraudulent schemes simultaneously, using your address and property as collateral for business loans, forging your signature on financial documents, and operating fake consulting contracts with companies that don't exist."
The search had revealed that Derek's consulting business was largely fictitious. While he had legitimate clients like Henderson Development, much of his claimed income came from fraudulent contracts with shell companies he had created himself, using the contracts to justify business loans and credit applications. The federal investigators are particularly interested in a scheme where Derek was billing fake consulting work to companies owned by associates, then using those fake invoices to justify business loans, Torres explained. It's a sophisticated fraud operation that could result in federal racketeering charges. More immediately relevant to Natalie's situation, the search had uncovered the forged documents Tyler had discovered, along with additional evidence of Derek and Camille's plan to have Natalie declared mentally incompetent.
The investigators had found correspondence with lawyers about guardianship procedures, medical professionals who might be willing to provide false testimony about Natalie's mental state, and detailed financial plans for managing Natalie's assets once they gained legal control. Dr. Cross, what your brother and sister-in-law were planning goes far beyond property theft, Torres said grimly. They were preparing to essentially steal your entire life. Your house, your medical practice, your financial assets, your personal autonomy. If they had succeeded in having you declared incompetent, you would have lost everything, while they gained complete control. The revelation of the full scope of Derek and Camille's scheme was both terrifying and validating. Natalie had known they were manipulating her and taking advantage of her generosity, but the evidence revealed that they had been planning to completely destroy her independence and autonomy while claiming to be protecting her best interests. The good news, Torres continued, is that we have more than enough evidence to pursue serious felony charges. Derek is looking at federal fraud charges that carry potential sentences of 15 to 20 years. Camille's charity fraud and participation in the identity theft could result in 10 to 15 years. These aren't misdemeanors or family disputes. These are serious crimes with serious consequences. Thursday morning brought the news that Derek and Camille had been hoping to avoid. Federal investigators had frozen all Derek's business accounts and initiated asset forfeiture proceedings for property and funds that could be traced to fraudulent activities. This included the car Derek had been driving, which had been purchased with a loan that used forged documents, and several pieces of expensive furniture and electronics in Natalie's house that had been bought with fraudulently obtained credit. But perhaps most satisfying for Natalie was learning that Derek and Camille's carefully constructed social identity was collapsing along with their financial schemes. Word of their deceptions had spread rapidly through Millbrook Falls' interconnected professional and social networks, creating a cascade of revealed lies and broken trust that would make it impossible for them to rebuild their reputation in the community. The house of cards they had built on Natalie's achievements and generosity was falling exactly as quickly and completely as it deserved to. Friday evening arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made everything feel crystalline and unforgiving. Natalie had requested the day off from the hospital, knowing that today would mark the culmination of everything she had been building toward. Derek and Camille were about to face the complete public exposure of their deception, and Natalie wanted to be present to witness every moment of their reckoning. The confrontation began at 6:30 p.m. when Detective Torres, accompanied by federal agents from the Financial Crimes Task Force, arrived at 847 Oakwood Drive with arrest warrants for Derek Cross and Camille Cross. Natalie had positioned herself in the living room where she could observe everything while remaining safely removed from the immediate action. Derek answered the door with the same confidence he had maintained throughout the week, still believing that his legal troubles were manageable misunderstandings that could be resolved with the right explanations and perhaps some strategic legal maneuvering. That confidence evaporated instantly when Torres displayed her badge and introduced the federal agents. Derek Cross, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, forgery, and racketeering. Torres announced, her voice carrying the formal authority that made the charges sound as serious as they truly were. Derek's immediate response was to look towards Natalie, his expression shifting from shock to accusation in a way that revealed exactly how he had always viewed their relationship. Even in this moment, facing federal charges for crimes he definitely committed, Derek's instinct was to blame Natalie for his consequences rather than accept responsibility for his actions. "Natalie, what did you do?" Derek demanded as Torres handcuffed him. "These people don't understand our family situation. You need to tell them that this is all a misunderstanding." Natalie remained seated, her voice calm and clinical when she responded. "Derek, these officers understand the situation perfectly. They understand that you forged my signature on financial documents, used my property as collateral for fraudulent loans, and planned to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could steal my assets. They understand it because I provided them with comprehensive evidence of your crimes." The blood drained from Derek's face as the full scope of Natalie's involvement in his arrest became clear. "You've been planning this. You've been setting us up. I've been documenting your crimes, Natalie corrected. There's a difference between setting someone up and ensuring they face consequences for their actions. Camille's arrest was more dramatic, largely because she had been upstairs when the officers arrived and initially tried to claim that she had been unaware of Derek's business activities. This defense crumbled quickly when Agent Sarah Chan produced recordings of Camille discussing the plan to have Natalie declared incompetent and gain control of her assets.
Mrs. Cross, we have recordings of you discussing strategies for removing Dr. Cross from her own home and assuming control of her medical practice, Agent Chen stated matter-of-factly. We also have evidence of your charity fraud activities and your systematic misrepresentation of your financial status to donors and community organizations. Camille's composure finally broke completely. This is insane! Natalie, tell them that we've been taking care of you. Tell them about how we've been managing your household because you can't handle social situations. The accusation hung in the air for a moment before Natalie responded with the kind of professional detachment she used when delivering difficult diagnoses to patients' families. Camille, managing my household would require you to actually contribute financially to its maintenance. Since you've never paid rent, utilities, property taxes, or any other expenses related to this house, I'm not sure what management services you think you've been providing. The federal agents had coordinated their timing carefully. As Derek and Camille were being processed and read their rights, additional law enforcement officers were executing search warrants at Derek's business office and Camille's storage unit, both of which contained evidence of their fraudulent activities that would support the prosecution's case. But the legal proceedings were only the beginning of Derek and Camille's public reckoning. As news of their arrests spread through Millbrook Falls' social and professional networks, the full extent of their deception began to emerge in ways that would make their social rehabilitation impossible, even if they managed to avoid significant prison time. The first major revelation came on Saturday morning when the Millbrook Falls Gazette published a front-page article about the arrests under the headline, "Local Couple Arrested in Elaborate Family Fraud Scheme." The article, which had been coordinated with Detective Torres to ensure accuracy while protecting ongoing investigations, detailed how Derek and Camille had systematically defrauded family members, business associates, and charitable organizations. Most damaging to their reputations was the article's description of how they had been living rent-free in Dr. Cross's house while presenting themselves as successful homeowners throughout the community. The article included quotes from several of Derek's former consulting clients describing how they had been deceived about his qualifications and experience. Mr. Cross presented himself as an experienced property developer who owned multiple homes in the area, Rebecca Santos was quoted as saying. "We hired him based on what we now know were completely fabricated credentials and a portfolio of work that he had no involvement with." The Gazette article was picked up by regional news outlets, ensuring that Derek and Camille's fraudulent activities would be known throughout Oregon's professional and social networks. This was particularly devastating for Camille, whose charity work had been based on connections across multiple communities that would now be aware of her deceptive practices. Sunday brought an even more comprehensive exposure when Channel 8 News aired an investigative segment about family financial fraud, using Derek and Camille's case as a primary example. The segment, titled "When Family Members Become Predators," featured interviews with experts on financial elder abuse and included detailed explanations of the tactics Derek and Camille had used to manipulate and exploit Natalie. Dr. Patricia Fleming appeared on the segment to discuss the legal aspects of the case. What makes the situation particularly egregious is the systematic nature of the deception. This wasn't a case of family members temporarily taking advantage of someone's generosity. This was a coordinated long-term plan to steal someone's entire life while claiming to be helping them. The news segment included security camera footage from Derek's meetings with real estate agents, where he had presented himself as the homeowner, as well as recordings of Camille's charity events where she had solicited donations using Natalie's house as a venue.
The visual evidence made their deception undeniable and demonstrated the calculated nature of their fraud. Most importantly for Natalie's vindication, the news segment interviewed several medical colleagues who praised her professional competence and personal integrity. Dr. Morrison appeared on camera to describe Natalie as one of the most skilled and dedicated surgeons I've worked with in 20 years of hospital administration. The idea that Dr. Cross needed anyone to manage her personal affairs is absurd. She routinely makes life and death decisions under extraordinary pressure. The suggestion that she was somehow incapable of managing her own household is not only false, but insulting to someone who has dedicated her life to saving children. The public vindication was deeply satisfying for Natalie, but it also served a strategic purpose. By establishing her competence and the respect she commanded from her colleagues, the media coverage made it impossible for Derek and Camille to later claim that they had been acting in her best interests or that she had needed their intervention. Monday morning brought news that Derek and Camille's legal situation was even more serious than initially expected. The federal investigation had uncovered connections to other fraud schemes involving associates who had been using similar tactics to exploit family members in different cities. This meant that Derek and Camille were now part of an organized family fraud network that could result in significantly longer prison sentences. The federal prosecutors are treating this as part of an organized family fraud network, Detective Torres informed Natalie during their meeting Monday afternoon. Derek's business associates have been using similar methods to defraud relatives and exploit family relationships for financial gain. This elevates the charges and the potential sentences substantially. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Derek and Camille's public reckoning was watching how quickly their former social circle abandoned them. The charity committees that had welcomed Camille as a sophisticated homeowner immediately distanced themselves from any association with her activities. Derek's business networking groups quietly removed him from membership lists and canceled speaking engagements he had been scheduled for.
Even Tyler's school, where Derek and Camille had presented themselves as successful community leaders, issued a statement clarifying that they had been misled about the family's circumstances and would be reviewing their policies for verifying parent and guardian information. The speed and thoroughness of their social exile demonstrated that Derek and Camille had built their entire identity on lies that collapsed the moment they were exposed to scrutiny. There would be no possibility of rebuilding their reputation in Millbrook Falls or any other community where their story became known. As Natalie prepared for bed Monday night in her own house, a house that was finally, truly hers again, she reflected on how completely Derek and Camille's carefully constructed facade had crumbled. Their arrests were just the beginning. The real justice lay in watching them face the comprehensive social, professional, and legal consequences of their systematic deception. Tomorrow would bring new developments in the legal proceedings, but tonight Natalie could sleep peacefully, knowing that Derek and Camille would never again be able to exploit her generosity or anyone else's trust. 6 months after Derek and Camille's arrests, Natalie stood in the Millbrook County Courthouse, listening to Judge Catherine Hendricks deliver the sentences that would close the most painful chapter of her life. The courtroom was packed with people whose lives had been affected by Derek and Camille's fraud scheme. Former clients, charity donors, business associates, and community members who had been deceived by their elaborate lies. Derek, wearing an orange jumpsuit that had replaced his expensive suits, showed no remorse as Judge Hendricks read his sentence. "Mr. Cross, your systematic fraud activities, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse represent some of the most callous crimes this court has seen. Your betrayal of family trust, combined with your exploitation of community goodwill, demonstrates a level of calculation that requires significant punishment." The judge's voice carried the weight of months of legal proceedings that had revealed the full scope of Derek's criminal enterprise. "You are hereby sentenced to 18 years in federal prison,
followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will also pay restitution in the amount of $347,000 to your victims and forfeit all assets obtained through fraudulent means. Derek's face remained stone throughout the sentencing, but Natalie noticed his hands trembling as the reality of spending the next 2 decades in prison settled over him. At 42, Derek would emerge from prison as an elderly man with no prospects, no reputation, and no community willing to accept him. Camille's sentencing was equally severe. Judge Hendricks had been particularly offended by Camille's exploitation of charitable organizations and her systematic manipulation of donors who had trusted her with their generosity. Mrs. Cross, your charity fraud activities represent a particularly egregious breach of community trust. The donors who contributed to what they believed were legitimate children's hospital fundraisers trusted you with money intended to help sick children. Your diversion of those funds for personal use is not only criminal, but morally reprehensible. Camille received 12 years in federal prison, followed by 4 years of supervised probation. She would also be required to pay restitution to the various charitable organizations she had defrauded, and would be permanently banned from any involvement with nonprofit fundraising activities. Unlike Derek, Camille broke down completely when her sentence was read. The woman who had spent 3 years presenting herself as a sophisticated socialite was now sobbing in an orange jumpsuit, finally confronting the reality that her carefully constructed identity had been built entirely on lies that were now costing her everything. But the courtroom sentences were only the most visible aspect of Derek and Camille's complete downfall. The civil lawsuits that had been filed by their various victims had resulted in additional financial judgments that would ensure they could never rebuild wealth even after serving their prison terms. Rebecca Santos and the other consulting clients Derek had defrauded had won a collective judgment of $180,000 for work that was never completed and damages caused by his misrepresentations. The real estate clients who had been deceived about Derek's qualifications had received settlements that would be paid from the liquidation of Derek's remaining assets. The Children's Hospital Auxiliary had filed a civil suit seeking damages, not only for the money Camille had stolen, but also for the reputational damage caused by her fraudulent fundraising activities. The hospital's legal team had argued successfully that Camille's deception had undermined donor confidence in legitimate fundraising efforts, creating long-term financial harm that extended far beyond the immediate theft. Most satisfying for Natalie was the resolution of the property-related fraud. The forged documents Derek had created in his attempt to claim ownership of her house had been thoroughly debunked through forensic analysis, and the court had issued a permanent injunction preventing Derek, Camille, or any of their associates from making future claims on the property. Additionally, Patricia Fleming had secured a judgment that required Derek and Camille to pay Natalie $89,000 in damages for the unauthorized use of her property for business purposes, the fraudulent charity events, and the emotional distress caused by their systematic manipulation and abuse. Dr. Cross, Judge Hendricks had said during the civil proceedings, "The court recognizes that you provided housing and support to family members who repaid your generosity with calculated fraud and betrayal. The damages awarded reflect not only the financial harm, but also the violation of trust that enabled these crimes to continue for years." The federal investigation had also revealed connections to Derek's associate network that resulted in additional prosecutions across 3 states. The FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force had used Derek and Camille's case as a foundation for dismantling what they called one of the most sophisticated fraud networks we've encountered. Detective Torres, who had been promoted to lieutenant following her work on the case,
visited Natalie the week after the sentencing to provide a final update on the investigation's broader impact.
Your willingness to come forward and provide evidence didn't just protect you from further victimization, Torres explained. It helped us identify and prosecute a network of fraudsters who were systematically exploiting family relationships across the region. 7 additional people have been arrested and charged with related crimes, and we've recovered over $2.3 million in fraudulently obtained assets. The ripple effects of Derek and Camille's exposure had been profound throughout Millbrook Falls. The business community had implemented new verification procedures for contractors and consultants, making it much more difficult for future fraudsters to operate using Derek's methods. The charitable organizations had established stricter oversight of fundraising activities and donor verification processes. But perhaps most importantly, the case had raised awareness about family financial abuse in ways that would protect other potential victims. The extensive media coverage had educated the public about warning signs of exploitation and encouraged people to seek help when family members exhibited predatory behavior. Tyler, now 17 and preparing for college, had emerged from his parents' disgrace with remarkable resilience. The court had awarded custody to Natalie, recognizing that she could provide the stability and support that Tyler needed to complete his education and build a healthy adult life. "I'm actually relieved," Tyler had told Natalie during one of their conversations about his parents' sentences. "Living with their lies was exhausting. I kept trying to make sense of things that didn't add up, and I blamed myself for not understanding our family situation. Now I know it wasn't supposed to make sense because it was all fake." Tyler's college applications had included essays about learning to recognize manipulation and the importance of integrity in family relationships. Rather than being damaged by his parents' crimes, Tyler had used the experience to develop a sophisticated understanding of ethics and personal responsibility that would serve him well in adulthood. The financial restitution Natalie received from the legal proceedings had been substantial, but more important was the restoration of her peace of mind and personal autonomy. The house on Oakwood Drive was finally completely hers again, free from the threat of fraudulent claims or manipulative family members who viewed her success as something to be exploited. Natalie had used some of the restitution money to establish a legal fund that would provide assistance to other victims of family financial fraud, ensuring that Derek and Camille's crimes would ultimately contribute to protecting future victims from similar exploitation. The medical community's response to Natalie's situation had been overwhelmingly supportive. Her colleagues had rallied around her during the legal proceedings, and her reputation in the field had actually been enhanced by her courage in pursuing justice against family members who had betrayed her trust. Dr. Morrison had nominated Natalie for the State Medical Association's Ethics in Practice Award, recognizing her integrity in handling a complex personal situation while maintaining her professional responsibilities. The nomination letter praised her, quote, "unwavering commitment to truth and justice, even when pursuing that truth required enormous personal courage and sacrifice," end quote. As Natalie prepared to leave the courthouse after the final sentencing hearing, she reflected on how completely Derek and Camille's attempt to steal her life had backfired. They had planned to gain control of her assets while destroying her independence and professional reputation. Instead, their crimes had resulted in their own complete destruction while enhancing Natalie's standing in every community that mattered to her. The house they had tried to steal was more securely hers than ever. The medical career they had attempted to undermine had been strengthened by the respect she had earned through handling their betrayal with dignity and determination. The family relationships they had tried to manipulate had been clarified in ways that protected Tyler's future, while ensuring that toxic influences could never again threaten Natalie's well-being. Derek and Camille had gambled everything on their ability to manipulate and exploit someone they viewed as weak and naive. They had lost everything because they fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. A skilled surgeon who approached problems with precision, documentation, and an unwavering commitment to achieving the correct outcome, regardless of how complex the procedure required. 2 years after Derek and Camille's sentencing, Natalie stood on the newly expanded deck of her transformed home, watching the sun set over Millbrook Falls while Tyler helped her prepare for their first major dinner party since the legal ordeal had ended. The house that had once been a source of conflict and manipulation had become exactly what she had originally envisioned, a sanctuary where genuine relationships could flourish. The transformation hadn't been just physical, though the renovations were stunning. Natalie had reclaimed every space that Derek and Camille had colonized, redesigning the master bedroom suite to reflect her own aesthetic preferences, converting Derek's former home office into a library where she could pursue the medical research that was bringing her national recognition, and, most symbolically, transforming the garage where she had been forced to eat Thanksgiving dinner into a workshop where she built furniture and pursued the woodworking hobby that provided a perfect counterbalance to her surgical precision. Aunt Nat, Dr. Patterson just texts that he's running about 10 minutes late, Tyler called from the kitchen, where he was helping arrange the appetizers that would welcome their guests. At 19, Tyler had grown into a confident young man whose academic success at Oregon State University reflected the stability and support that Natalie had provided during the most difficult period of his life. Their relationship had evolved into something deeper than the traditional aunt-nephew dynamic. Tyler had chosen to spend his summers working at the hospital, initially volunteering in pediatric care and gradually moving toward pre-med coursework that suggested he might follow Natalie into medicine. But unlike his parents, Tyler's interest in Natalie's career came from genuine admiration for her work rather than calculations about how her success might benefit him.
Perfect timing, Natalie replied, adjusting the flowers she had arranged using blooms from the garden she had planted in the spot where Derek's fake business equipment used to be stored. That gives us just enough time to finish setting up. Tonight's dinner party represented more than just social entertaining. Natalie was hosting a gathering of colleagues, friends, and community members who had supported her through the legal proceedings and who now formed the authentic social network she had built to replace the hollow relationships that Derek and Camille had manipulated. Dr. Patricia Fleming would be there, having become not just Natalie's attorney, but a genuine friend whose shared interest in medical ethics had led to several collaborative projects. Detective Torres, now Lieutenant Torres, was bringing her partner Sarah to meet the woman whose case had launched Torres into a specialization in family financial crimes that was making her a regional expert in the field. Marcus Reed, the private investigator whose thorough work had been crucial to exposing Derek and Camille's crimes, was attending with his wife. Reed had become something of a legend in his field after the case, and his methods were now being studied by law enforcement agencies across the country as a model for investigating family fraud. Most importantly, Dr. James Morrison and his wife Judith would be there, representing the hospital community that had not only supported Natalie during her ordeal, but had elevated her to new positions of leadership in recognition of her integrity and professional excellence. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock, and Natalie opened it to find Dr. Morrison holding a bottle of wine and wearing the kind of genuine smile that she had learned to distinguish from the performative expressions that had characterized her interactions with Derek and Camille. "Dr. Cross, this house looks absolutely magnificent," Morrison said, as she welcomed him and Judith inside. "The renovations you've done really showcase the property's original character while making it completely your own." The comment would have been unremarkable except for its contrast to the countless times Derek and Camille had taken credit for improvements they hadn't made. Morrison's acknowledgement of Natalie's ownership and creative vision represented the kind of authentic recognition that she had been denied for years. As the evening progressed, Natalie found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed since that Thanksgiving night when she had sat in the garage contemplating her situation with newfound clarity.
The guests filling her dining room were people who knew her true worth and chose to spend time with her based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than calculations about what they could gain from the relationship. Lieutenant Torres regaled the group with stories about how the techniques developed during Derek and Camille's investigation were being used to catch other family fraudsters. Dr. Cross's methodical documentation and willingness to pursue justice, no matter how personally difficult, has resulted in a model that we're now teaching to investigators nationwide, Torres explained. Her case has probably prevented hundreds of other families from experiencing similar exploitation. The conversation turned to Tyler's upcoming transfer to medical school, a goal that had become achievable partly because of the college fund Natalie had established using some of the restitution money from Derek and Camille's crimes. Tyler spoke about his research interests with the kind of passionate intelligence that reminded Natalie of her own early attraction to medicine, but without the defensive intensity that had characterized her own journey from working-class origins to professional success. "The thing about Tyler," Natalie said during a toast before dessert, "is that he's learned to value integrity and authenticity in ways that will serve him well throughout his life. He's seen what happens when people build their lives on lies and manipulation, and he's chosen a different path." Tyler's response was characteristically thoughtful. "Living through my parents' crimes taught me that nothing built on deception can last. Aunt Nat showed me that the only sustainable success comes from genuine competence, honest relationships, and treating people with the respect they deserve rather than viewing them as resources to be exploited." The evening's most poignant moment came when Patricia Fleming presented Natalie with a framed copy of the legal judgment that had formalized Derek and Camille's permanent banishment from any involvement in Natalie's life. This represents more than just legal protection. It's a declaration that your generosity and success belong to you, and that family relationships based on exploitation and manipulation have no legal or moral standing. As the guests departed around 11 o'clock, each expressing genuine appreciation for the evening and making plans for future gatherings, Natalie and Tyler cleaned up together in the kitchen that was finally completely theirs. "Do you ever think about them?" Tyler asked quietly, referring to his parents without naming them directly. "Wonder how they're doing in prison?" Natalie considered the question while loading the dishwasher with plates that she had chosen herself, purchased with money she had earned, and used to host people who valued her for who she truly was. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not with regret or sympathy. I think about them the way I think about a successful surgery, as evidence that identifying problems accurately and addressing them completely leads to better outcomes for everyone involved." Tyler understood the medical metaphor. They were like a tumor that needed to be removed to save the healthy tissue. Exactly. And now we're proof that the patient not only survived the procedure, but became stronger and healthier than before.
The next morning, Natalie woke up in her master bedroom suite to sunlight streaming through windows that faced the garden she had designed, in a house that was legally, financially, and emotionally hers without qualification or compromise. Her phone showed messages from colleagues consulting her on difficult cases, invitations to speak at medical conferences, and updates from the Family Fraud Prevention Foundation she had established. At the hospital, her reputation had evolved beyond just surgical excellence to include recognition as someone whose personal integrity matched her professional competence. Medical students sought her out as a mentor, not just for her technical skills, but for her demonstrated ability to handle complex ethical situations with clarity and courage. The house on Oakwood Drive had become what Natalie had originally envisioned, a place where authentic relationships could flourish, where her professional achievements were celebrated rather than exploited,
and where the next generation, represented by Tyler, could learn that success built on integrity was the only kind worth pursuing. Standing in her kitchen that morning, making coffee in peace while planning another day of saving children's lives, Natalie reflected on the perfect justice of her situation. Derek and Camille had tried to steal her house, her money, her reputation, and ultimately her freedom. Instead, their crimes had resulted in her gaining complete security in all those areas, while they lost everything they had tried to take from her. The garage, where they had forced her to eat Thanksgiving dinner, now housed the woodworking tools where she created beautiful things with her hands. The dining room, where they had entertained guests at her expense, now hosted gatherings of people who genuinely valued her company. The master bedroom they had claimed as their own now provided her with the peaceful rest that came from living without deception or manipulation. They had gambled everything on the assumption that family obligation would prevent her from defending herself effectively. They had lost everything because they had fundamentally misunderstood the difference between genuine generosity and exploitable weakness. Dr. Natalie Cross had built a life worth protecting, and when that life was threatened, she had protected it with the same precision, thoroughness, and unwavering commitment to successful outcomes that she brought to every surgical procedure. Some structures, once compromised, could only be saved through complete reconstruction. Natalie had proven that the result of that reconstruction could be stronger, more beautiful, and more enduring than anything that had existed before.